Think for yourself. The teacher might be wrong. As a little girl, these are the 8 words I saw placed prominently above the chalkboard in my mother's classroom. I knew even then that I wanted to follow in my mom's footsteps and become a public high school teacher. Years later, in 2004, when I was setting up my first classroom at the Seattle High School where I currently teach, I chose to display those same words. I knew that I wanted my classroom to be a space where students felt valued, where they realized that their ideas were just as important as mine. The school at which I teach is the widest public high school in the city of Seattle, with 75% of its students identifying as Caucasian. I remember my mom talking about the challenges of incorporating anti-racist practices at the high school where she taught. With a mostly white student body and almost entirely white staff, it was easy for many of the teachers and students at the school to see racism as someone else's problem. I have become convinced that it is especially important for white educators in majority white schools to ensure that their students and colleagues are educated about racism. Because we as white people are not experiencing the pervasive daily racism that people of color experience. This is compounded by the fact that white students who grow up living in mostly white neighborhoods and attending mostly white schools often have very little direct contact with people of color. This means that unless their parents and teachers actively choose to discuss race and racism with the young people in their lives, our students will grow up with a woefully incomplete understanding of race and racism. This leads to a lack of knowledge about the profound impact that race has on the power structures in our country, and a lack of understanding as to how people of different races are treated in our country. It is our job as educators, especially white educators in majority white schools, to ensure that our students have the opportunity to learn about how and why racism is still a problem, so that they can be part of working toward a more just society. Especially in a majority white school, students and teachers of color should not be expected to educate white students or white teachers about racism. I've worked with students and teachers of color who feel like they are expected to be experts on race and racism, or to be leading the fight against racism in their schools. If and when the topic of racism comes up in a classroom where there are few students of color, well-intentioned white teachers sometimes make these students the focus of the discussion. Share your experience with us so that we can understand, rather than expecting white students to do the hard work of acknowledging and understanding how white people benefit from systemic racism in our country. I have talked with students of color who already feel isolated and misunderstood in majority white schools. These feelings are compounded when these students are expected to lead the way for their white peers. We as white teachers need to be proactive about ensuring we have created an environment where students of color feel safe, respected, and included, rather than spotlighted or isolated. Along the same lines, we as white educators should work to ensure that we are not expecting our colleagues of color to shoulder the burden of anti-racist work while shying away from the work ourselves. I try to remind myself that it's okay to be uncomfortable, and I acknowledge that there are times where I will say or do the wrong thing when I'm discussing racism with students. The important thing is that I'm willing to own my mistakes, and I'm committed to learning and growing from these mistakes so that I can do better next time. In these instances, I'm reminded of Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel's words regarding neutrality and oppression. He says, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." If I as a white educator remain neutral about racism, I am not remaining neutral at all. My silence is helping to perpetuate racism. Next, I'd like to share some concrete steps I've taken in my own life to become a more actively anti-racist educator. I started by doing some work to learn more about the history of racism in our country and to understand more about my own identity and privilege as a white person. This included attending lecture series about the history of racism at a local university and reading widely from leaders in the field of race and equity work. I started a book group with other educators and a discussion group with other parents who were interested in learning more about race and racism. For me, it helped to do this initial work in spaces that were distinct from my school life. I was still able to talk about how and why this learning was important for my growth as a teacher, but it also encouraged me to think about how and why this learning was important for my growth as a parent and a human being. This has allowed the anti-racist work I do as a teacher to be more authentic because it's grounded in how I see my purpose in the greater world. As an English language arts teacher, I had long been a proponent of teaching a diverse set of texts, but I now knew that teaching diverse authors alone is not anti-racist. I needed to go a step further and make my teaching about race more explicitly. To this end, I crafted a new unit called Race in America around 3 core texts that I was already teaching: Monster by Walter Dean Myers, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, and American-Born Chinese by Jean Luen Yang. Each of these novels features a teenage protagonist of color and is written by an author of color, which provides a clear entry point for students to begin exploring issues of race and racism. I asked students to track the character development of their novel's protagonist, especially with regard to how the character's racial identity impacts their development. We supplement students' reading of these novels with a wide variety of shorter texts that explore issues of race and racism, and students draw connections between the experiences of the novel's protagonists and the issues that emerge in the supplemental texts, such as white privilege, white supremacy, implicit bias, microaggressions. Since starting this unit, I've expanded the core novel options to include texts by female authors of color featuring female protagonists of color: This Side of Home by Renee Watson and The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. In the case of The Hate You Give, students were the driving force behind the addition of this text. This provided students with a concrete way for them to work on turning their study of race and racism into action. It's important that students are provided with an opportunity to take meaningful steps toward fighting racism, as learning about racism can sometimes leave students feeling hopeless or overwhelmed. Helping students to see their own power and encouraging them to recognize their ability to make a positive difference in the world can alleviate some of the cynicism and frustration students feel as they deepen their understanding of the long history of institutional racism and white supremacy in our country. This brings me to my final recommendation about anti-racist work in education, and it also brings me back to where this talk began, the most important expectation in my classroom. Think for yourself. The teacher might be wrong. This idea is especially important as a white teacher doing anti-racist work in a predominantly white school. Students, especially students of color, need to feel safe calling me out when I make mistakes. They need to know that they can hold me accountable and point out to me when the impact of my behavior is harmful. It is also critical that we as teachers invite students to be active participants in our anti-racist work. Student learning should not be confined to the classroom. Students need to be provided the opportunity to take an active role in anti-racist activism in their school and in the greater community. I hope that you will consider the ways in which you can continue to deepen and expand anti-racist teaching in your own practice. Doing so is not easy, and we will make mistakes along the way. But if we remain silent in the face of racism, we are complicit in perpetuating a system that is harmful to our students. As Elie Wiesel said, we must always take sides. Given the choice, let us take the side of truth. Let us take the side of inclusion. Let us take the side of justice, because equity matters.